Boeing or Airbus? For decades, that's been the only real question in commercial aviation. Two giants, splitting almost the entire planet between them. But there's an aircraft out there that doesn't look like anything either of them has ever put into service. It's shaped like a giant flying letter V, and the people behind it claim it could burn 20% less fuel than the most advanced airliner flying today. And here's the twist. It's not alone. Right now, in 2026, there's a quiet race happening to throw out the airplane shape we've used for 70 years and replace it with something radical. Stick around, because the story behind all of this is wilder, older, and stranger than you think. Let me ask you something first. Why do almost all airliners look the same? Seriously, think about it for a second. A Boeing 737, an Airbus A320, a 777, an A350. Strip away the paint and the logos, and they're basically the same shape. A long metal tube with two wings stuck on the sides and a tail at the back. That design hasn't fundamentally changed since the 1950s. The de Havilland Comet, the Boeing 707, all the way up to the brand new jets rolling out of factories today. Same basic recipe. Tube, wings, tail, done. And here's the thing that most people never stop to consider. That's not because it's the best possible shape. It's because it's the safest bet. It's predictable. It's easy to build, easy to certify, easy to load with passengers and cargo. The whole industry, the airports, the gates, the maintenance crews, the regulators, everything is built around that tube and wings idea. Changing it is terrifyingly expensive and risky, so nobody does. Year after year, decade after decade, the planes get better engines, lighter materials, smarter wingtips, but the fundamental shape stays frozen in time. But a small group of engineers in the Netherlands looked at that tube and asked a very simple, very dangerous question. What if the tube itself is the problem? That question is the seed of the flying V. And to understand why it matters, you need to understand what a fuselage actually does to a plane in the air. Because here's the uncomfortable truth the aviation industry has lived with for 70 years. The fuselage, that big metal tube where you sit, eat your tiny pretzels, and try to sleep, does almost nothing useful when it comes to flying. It carries people and cargo, sure. But aerodynamically, it's mostly dead weight. It creates drag, it adds mass, and it produces almost no lift. The wings do all the heavy lifting, literally. The tube is just along for the ride, dragging through the air and burning fuel the entire way. Engineers have known this forever, and for almost as long, they've dreamed of a different solution. What if you could get rid of the tube entirely? What if the whole aircraft was a wing? An airplane where every single part of the structure helps generate lift, where there's no dead weight, just punching a hole in the sky. That dream has a name. It's called the flying wing, and it has a long, dramatic, and honestly kind of tragic history. Let's go back, way back. The idea of a pure flying wing goes back to the early 20th century, but the most famous early attempts came out of two places, Germany and the United States. And the German story is honestly incredible. In Germany, two brothers named Walter and Reimagining Horten became obsessed with the flying wing. Here's the wild part. Neither of them had a university engineering degree. They grew up in the gliding clubs of the 1930s, which existed partly because the Treaty of Versailles had banned Germany from building military aircraft, so flying got disguised as harmless civilian glider sport. The brothers flew their first glider in 1933 when Walter was 19 and Reimagining just 17. They reasoned, correctly, that a tailless flying wing offered the lowest possible weight and the least drag, because there was no fuselage just hanging there creating resistance. Sound familiar? That's the exact same insight driving the flying V today, except the Hortens had it almost a century ago. During the war, the brothers convinced the head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, to fund a jet-powered flying wing, the Horten Ho 229. Göring reportedly handed over 500,000 Reichsmarks. The aircraft was meant to meet a brutal requirement nicknamed 3 times 1,000, carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs over 1,000 kilometers at 1,000 kilometers per hour. The result was a sleek, jet-powered flying wing built from steel and laminated plywood, powered by the same Junkers Jumo turbojet engines used in the Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. A powered prototype flew in test flights in early 1945. And here's a detail that gives the whole thing a science fiction edge. Reimagining Horten claimed years later that he'd wanted to mix charcoal dust into the wood glue to absorb radar waves and make the aircraft harder to detect. Historians still argue about whether that's true, but think about that for a second. A radar-evading flying wing in 1945. The aircraft looks, to modern eyes, almost exactly like a stealth bomber, because in a sense, it was an ancestor of one. The war ended before the Ho-229 could go anywhere. The Allies recovered the prototype, and the only surviving example sits in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum collection to this day. Keep that name, Northrop, in your head for a moment, because it's about to come back in the most poetic way possible. Because across the Atlantic, in America, an engineer named Jack Northrop was chasing the very same dream. He believed, deep in his bones, that the flying wing was the future of aviation. Less drag, less weight, more efficiency. On paper, it was perfect. After World War II, Northrop built two enormous flying wing bombers for the U.S. military, the piston-powered XB-35 and the jet-powered YB-49. And here's where the story gets painful. These aircraft flew. They actually flew. They looked like something out of science fiction, decades ahead of their time. But they had a serious problem. They were incredibly difficult to control. Without a tail, the aircraft kept wanting to wander, to yaw from side to side, to become unstable. In the 1940s, the technology to fix that simply didn't exist. There were no computers fast enough to make tiny corrections hundreds of times a second the way modern fly-by-wire systems do. The program was eventually canceled, and the existing aircraft were scrapped. Jack Northrop's dream was crushed. Now here's the part that gives me chills. Decades later, in the 1980s, the company Northrop founded developed the B-2 Spirit, the famous stealth bomber. And what shape is the B-2? A flying wing. Almost the exact same shape Jack Northrop had been fighting for his entire career. The story goes that an elderly, retired Jack Northrop was secretly brought in to see a model of the B-2 before he died. He could barely speak by then, so he wrote on a piece of paper something like, "Now I know why God has kept me alive these last few years." The flying wing had finally won. It just took 40 years and the invention of computers fast enough to keep it stable. So why am I telling you all this? Because that exact problem, the flying wing being too unstable, too radical, too hard to control, is the wall that every efficient but weird aircraft design slams into. The shape that saves the most fuel is also the shape that's the hardest to build, certify, and trust with 300 passengers on board. And that tension, that exact trade-off, is the entire drama of the aircraft we're talking about today. If you're enjoying this so far, do me a quick favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel grow. And subscribe, because we go deep on stories like this all the time. All right, back to it. So the flying wing is the holy grail of efficiency. But a pure flying wing, like the B-2, is brutal for passenger flights. Why? Practical reasons. In a pure flying wing, the cabin is incredibly wide and flat. The people sitting in the middle have no windows. The structure is hard to pressurize because flat shapes don't handle internal pressure as well as round tubes do. And evacuating passengers in an emergency from a huge flat cabin is a nightmare. Boeing and NASA actually spent years studying a passenger version of this idea. It's called the blended wing body. NASA had been funding research into the concept since the 1990s, and Boeing built a remote-controlled test aircraft called the X-48. Two of these unmanned, remote-piloted X-48 models flew around 120 test flights between 2007 and 2012, proving the configuration could actually be controlled and flown. The data was promising. NASA found the shape could generate less noise and fewer emissions than an equally advanced conventional aircraft, partly because you can mount the engines on top of the body, so the aircraft itself acts as a sound shield between the engine noise and the people on the ground. Think about that. A plane that's quieter for the neighborhoods around the airport simply because of where the engines sit. But despite all that promise, the practical headaches of putting paying passengers inside a giant flying wing kept the idea stuck in research labs for years. And there's another problem with the blended wing body that doesn't get talked about much. Because the whole thing is one big custom-shaped blob, you basically have to design each size of aircraft from scratch. You can't just stretch it like manufacturers do with conventional jets. That makes it commercially awkward, because airlines love having a family of aircraft. A short one, a medium one, a long one, all sharing most of the same parts. And this is where the genius of the Flying V comes in, because the people behind it didn't try to build a pure flying wing like the B-2, and they didn't go for a blended wing body blob either. They found a clever middle path. a compromise that keeps most of the efficiency without all of the deal-breaking problems. The Flying V is, in technical terms, a flying wing, but one with a V-shaped passenger cabin built into the structure. And crucially, the project's lead engineers have pointed out that the V can be stretched or shortened to build a whole family of aircraft using around 95% of the same parts. That solves the exact commercial weakness that has held the blended wing body back. Now let me tell you where this thing actually came from, because the origin story is fantastic. The Flying V was not born in a giant corporate design office with $1 billion budget. It started with a student. Back around 2014 and 2015, a young engineer named Justus Benad was working on his thesis project while interning at Airbus in Hamburg, in a department that was exploring alternative wing configurations. Benad came up with this V-shaped flying wing idea, and a patent for the concept was filed through Airbus around that time. The idea even won in its category at the Royal Aeronautical Society's Young Researcher competition back in 2015. So this wasn't just a doodle. It was a serious, recognized piece of engineering work from the very beginning. Then, in 2016, the concept found a real home. Delft University of Technology, TU Delft, in the Netherlands, one of the most respected aerospace engineering schools on the planet, picked up the idea and started developing it seriously. The project leader, Dr. Roelof Vos, has told the story of how a patent first caught his attention back in 2014. His reaction, as a researcher, was basically, "These are bold claims. We need to check them thoroughly." And so they did. They didn't just take the design at face value. They reworked it, gave it an oval-shaped fuselage cross-section instead of a simple round pipe, ran the aerodynamics, and found the numbers actually got better than the original estimates. That refined version became the Delft Flying V. And there's a lovely detail about how that handoff happened. The patent for the V-shaped concept actually appeared in the media, and that's what first caught Roelof Vos's eye back in 2014. As a flight performance researcher, his instinct wasn't to get excited. It was to get skeptical. These were bold claims about fuel savings, and his job was to either confirm them or tear them apart. So his team rebuilt the design from the ground up, gave the fuselage that oval cross-section, and ran the real aerodynamics. And to their genuine surprise, the concept didn't just hold up. It looked even better than the original numbers suggested. That's the moment a curiosity became a research program. A scientist set out to debunk something and ended up becoming its champion. I love that, because it's the opposite of hype. Nobody fell in love with a pretty render. They tried to prove it wrong, failed, and followed the data. And then came the moment that turned heads worldwide. In June 2019, at the IATA Annual Congress in Seoul, TU, Delft, and KLM, the Dutch flag carrier, and one of the oldest airlines in the world still operating under its original name, announced a partnership to develop the Flying V. KLM signed on as a partner, contributing to the research, and tied the whole thing to its 100th anniversary celebrations. Think about that combination for a second. A radical aircraft shape, born from a student's thesis, refined by a top-tier university, backed by a real airline that actually flies passengers for a living, with Airbus engineers staying connected to the project too. That's not a napkin sketch anymore. That's a serious effort. So, what does the Flying V actually look like, and what are the real numbers? Here's where it gets beautiful. Imagine taking the traditional tube and wings plane and just deleting the tube. Instead, you take the wings and merge them directly with the passenger cabin, the cargo hold, and the fuel tanks, so that the entire aircraft forms one continuous V shape. The passengers don't sit in a separate tube. They sit inside the wings themselves. The cargo sits in the wings. The fuel sits in the wings. Everything is integrated into that V structure, forming the two legs of the V. Let me give you the actual specifications, because they're genuinely impressive. The full-scale Flying V is designed to be around 57 meters long, with a wingspan of about 65 meters and a height of roughly 17 meters. Now here's the clever part. That 65-meter wingspan is almost exactly the same as the Airbus A350. And that's completely intentional. By keeping the same wingspan, the Flying V can fit into the existing airport infrastructure. The same gates, the same runways, even the same hangars built for the A350. So even though it looks like an alien spacecraft, it's secretly designed to slot right into the world we already have. That's smart engineering, not just bold engineering. In terms of capacity, the standard configuration is designed to carry around 361 passengers, along with roughly 160 cubic meters of cargo. That's right in the same league as a wide-body long-haul jet. The design even includes a pressurized cabin with an oval cross-section, chosen specifically to handle the structural and aerodynamic demands. And the planned fuel capacity is in the range of 140,000 liters of kerosene. These aren't vague dreams. These are detailed engineering figures from the actual research. But the number everyone cares about is the efficiency. The Flying V is projected to use around 20% less fuel than the Airbus A350, specifically the A350-1000, one of the most modern, most efficient airliners flying today, while carrying a comparable number of passengers and a comparable amount of cargo over the same distance with the same wingspan. 20%. Let me put that in perspective for you. Aviation is an industry where engineers fight tooth and nail for a 1 or 2% fuel improvement. They'll redesign a wingtip, shave grams off a seat, reshape a single panel, all for a fraction of a percent. And here's a design claiming 20% in one leap. That's not an improvement. That's a different category entirely. Where does that 20% come from? It's basically two things working together. First, the shape. Project leader Roelof Vos has explained it simply. The Flying V is smaller than the A350 and has less surface area exposed to the airflow relative to the volume it carries. Less surface area means less drag. Less drag means less fuel. Second, the weight. Because the lift and the cabin are integrated into the same structure, you don't need all the extra reinforcement that a conventional plane requires to transfer the lifting force from the wings into a separate fuselage. The research suggests the structural mass could be significantly lower than a comparable A350-style aircraft. Some finite element modeling points to the structure being on the order of 17% lighter, partly thanks to extensive use of carbon fiber reinforced materials. Lighter plane, less drag, less fuel. That's the whole magic trick. Now I want to be straight with you, because honesty matters on this channel. That 20% figure comes from research, computer calculations, wind tunnel tests, and engineering projections, not from a full-size aircraft carrying real passengers across the Atlantic. This is still fundamentally a research project, so treat that number as a serious, well-grounded engineering projection, not a guarantee printed on a ticket. Even the project leader has been refreshingly honest about this. He's openly said that there's still so much they don't know, and that in another few years they might even conclude it isn't feasible after all. That's not weakness. That's exactly how real, careful engineering is supposed to sound. So here's a question for you to drop in the comments. Would you actually fly on an airplane shaped like a giant V, where you're sitting inside the wing instead of a normal tube? Be honest. Yes or no? Let me know down below. Now, let's talk about the moment this thing stopped being just a computer model and actually took to the sky. Because in the summer of 2020, the team did something incredible. They built a scale model of the Flying V, a remotely piloted, battery-powered version with a wingspan of around 3 meters and a weight of about 22.5 kilograms. And they took it to a well-guarded airbase in Germany to fly it for real, working alongside an Airbus team. Project leader Roelof Vos and lead engineer Malcolm Brown and their crew had spent ages on wind tunnel tests and ground tests to get to this point. And this is the kind of moment that makes engineers hold their breath, because remember the history we just talked about. Remember the flying wings that wouldn't stay stable. Remember the whole reason this shape stayed locked away in research for decades. The team had a very specific worry going in. They were concerned about something called rotation. Basically, whether the aircraft would be able to lift its nose and get off the ground properly during takeoff. Their calculations had warned them this could be tricky. As Vos put it, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You need to fly to know for sure. So they optimized the model specifically to deal with the takeoff concern, and then they sent it down the runway. The scale model accelerated. At around 80 kilometers per hour, it lifted off. It climbed. It flew. The remote pilot, Nando van Arnhem, took it up, performed a series of test maneuvers, and brought it back down when the batteries ran low. The takeoff that they'd been so nervous about? It went smoothly. The landing, though, was described as slightly rough, and that points to one of the genuinely tricky things about this design. Because of its shape, the Flying V has to land with its nose held high, in a manner that's actually been compared to the Concorde. That nose-high attitude means the landing gear needs to be unusually long. So landing is one of the areas the team flagged for more work and refinement. And since I just mentioned the Concorde, let's pause on that, because it's the single most important cautionary tale in this entire story. And it's a real one, not a legend. The Concorde was a radical aircraft, a tailless, ogival delta-winged, supersonic airliner with that famous drooping nose, the droop snoot, which lowered during takeoff and landing so the pilots could actually see the runway over that long, pointed fuselage, exactly because the aircraft had to fly at such a steep nose-high angle at low speed. It was an Anglo-French masterpiece, built jointly by the British and the French, and it carried passengers across the Atlantic at twice the speed of sound, cutting the New York to London journey to under 3.5 hours. By almost any engineering measure, it was a triumph. The longest-serving Concorde pilot said no military plane came anywhere close. Neil Armstrong reportedly said that, from a technical perspective, the Concorde was as big a challenge as putting a man on the moon, and yet it failed commercially. Why? Read this carefully, because it's the exact lesson hanging over the Flying V and every radical aircraft today. The Concorde was designed before the oil price shocks of the 1970s, and it was, in effect, a machine that converted enormous amounts of fuel into raw speed. It carried only around 100 passengers, but burned roughly the same fuel as a Boeing 747, an aircraft that could fly twice as far with 4 times as many people. It was deafeningly loud, so its sonic boom banned it from flying supersonic over land, restricting it mostly to transatlantic ocean routes. Only 20 were ever built, and only 2 airlines ever flew them, British Airways and Air France. And even then, largely because those airlines were state-run at the time. After the tragic crash of Air France Flight 4590 in 2000, followed by the slump in air travel after September 11th, and with maintenance costs climbing into the stratosphere, the Concorde made its final flight in 2003. Supersonic passenger travel has been gone from our skies ever since. So here's the uncomfortable lesson the Concorde teaches. Being technically brilliant is not enough. Being beautiful is not enough. Being decades ahead of your time is not enough. An aircraft has to make economic sense. It has to be efficient, affordable to run, and able to fit into the real, messy world of airports, regulations, and airline balance sheets. The Concorde chased prestige and speed and ignored efficiency, and the economics eventually killed it. The Flying V, Jet Zero, and the Airbus blended wing are, in a sense, chasing the exact opposite goal. They're not selling speed. They're selling efficiency. The one thing the Concorde never had. And if there's any reason to be optimistic that these radical new shapes might actually succeed where the Concorde failed, it's precisely that. They're solving for the thing that actually keeps airlines alive: cost per seat, per mile, per gallon. That's not glamorous, but it's the thing that wins. Quick question while we're here, because I'm curious what you think. If supersonic travel came back tomorrow, a new Concorde, but quieter and more efficient, would you pay extra to cross the Atlantic in 3 hours? Or would you rather have a cheaper, greener flight that takes a bit longer? Drop a comment, because this is exactly the trade-off the whole industry is wrestling with. And if you're finding this interesting, smash that like button and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference for a channel like this. But here's what matters. It flew. It was controllable. And it handed the researchers a mountain of real-world data they could never have gotten from simulations alone. They took that flight data and used it to build a better aerodynamic model, which they could then load into a flight simulator for all kinds of future research. That single flight transformed the Flying V from a beautiful idea into a beautiful idea that demonstrably works in the air. And that's the difference between this and 100 other futuristic aircraft concepts you've seen in slick promotional videos that never leave the screen. This one flew. A real, physical, V-shaped aircraft lifted off the ground under its own power and landed in one piece. That puts it in a very small, very serious club. But let's pump the brakes for a second, because I promised you the truth, and the truth includes the hard parts. Building a 3-meter research model that flies is one thing. Building a full-size passenger airliner that hundreds of people trust with their lives, day after day, is a completely different mountain to climb. And the Flying V faces some very real, very stubborn challenges before it could ever carry you on vacation. Here's the first big one, and it's a fascinating problem. The passengers sit inside the wings, spread out from the center line of the aircraft. That sounds cool, and it is, but it creates a comfort issue that the original designer, Justus Benad, actually identified all the way back in his thesis. In a normal tube, everyone is sitting close to the center line. When the plane rolls or banks during a turn, you barely feel it. But in the Flying V, passengers seated further out toward the tips of the V would experience more movement during a roll. more of that swaying, accelerating sensation. In fact, this concern is so fundamental that it actually limits how wide the V can be. You literally can't seat passengers too far from the center axis, or the ride becomes uncomfortable. The engineering of the entire planform is shaped, in part, by this one human comfort constraint. I find that incredible. The math of the whole aircraft bending around how a passenger's stomach feels in a turn. Then there's the cabin itself, and this is where it actually gets kind of luxurious and futuristic. The interior of a V-shaped wing isn't a simple, straight tube. The cross-section is wider toward the front and angled, which forces a complete rethink of how you arrange seats. The TU Delft team and the designers have explored several seating concepts to make the most of this unusual space, including individual seats, lounge-style chaise seating, group seating arrangements, and even collapsible beds. There was a patented idea for a 3-berth bed module that could fold down into a 3-seat bench for takeoff and landing. Some concepts even imagine chaise-long seats mounted toward the ceiling to save floor space and let passengers change posture. The team has genuinely treated the Flying V as a chance to reinvent the passenger experience, not just the aerodynamics. And then there's the boring stuff that's secretly the most important: safety certification, that 90-second evacuation rule. The hard, non-negotiable requirement that everyone on board can get out within 90 seconds has to be proven for a cabin shape that has never existed before. Researchers connected to the project have actually published work simulating and comparing evacuation from the Flying V against a conventional aircraft, because you simply cannot certify a passenger plane without solving this. Pressurizing that oval cabin safely, fitting the right number of emergency doors, making sure people can flow out quickly. All of it has to be proven, not just promised. And here's maybe the biggest, most powerful obstacle of all. The entire global aviation system is built around the tube and wing shape. Now, the Flying V team was clever about this, matching the A350's wingspan so it fits existing gates and runways. But fitting through the door is not the same as being ready for daily airline service. Maintenance procedures, pilot training, spare parts, the way ground crews load and service the aircraft, all of it would need adapting. And building a brand new clean sheet airliner from scratch costs an almost unimaginable amount of money and takes well over a decade even for established manufacturers. This is exactly why companies like Boeing and Airbus are so cautious about radical designs. It's not that they can't imagine something better than the tube. It's that the cost, the risk, the certification battles, and the infrastructure problems are absolutely enormous. When you're selling thousands of aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars each, betting the company on a wild new shape is a terrifying gamble. So the big manufacturers tend to improve the existing formula step by step. Better engines, lighter materials, smarter wings, rather than throwing the whole thing out and starting over. Interestingly, Airbus has stayed connected to the Flying V project and even supported the flight test, which tells you they're curious. But curiosity in a research lab is very different from committing a production line. And that's actually what makes a university project like the Flying V so valuable. A research institution like TU Delft can take the risk that a giant corporation can't. They can explore the wild idea, fly the scale model, gather the data, and prove what's possible, without the pressure of having to sell 10,000 of them next year. Universities are where the dangerous, beautiful ideas get to breathe. It's worth appreciating the timeline here, because it shows how patient this kind of work has to be. Justus Benad sketched the first version around 2013 to 2015. TU Delft picked it up in 2016. The scale model flew in 2020. And the team itself describes the road ahead in years, not months. Wind tunnel work, a full-scale cabin mock-up, more flight testing, structural validation. Project leader Roelof Vos has been candid that there's still a great deal they don't know, and that the project might still hit a wall that proves it isn't feasible. That's more than a decade of careful, methodical work for an aircraft that may or may not ever carry a passenger. This is not the world of overnight tech disruption. Aviation moves at the speed of safety, because the cost of getting it wrong is measured in human lives. Every rivet, every panel, every emergency exit has to be proven beyond doubt. And honestly, that slowness is a feature, not a bug. The reason flying is statistically one of the safest things you can do is precisely because this industry refuses to rush. So when you hear that the Flying V is still years away, that's not a sign it's failing. That's a sign it's being done properly. If this kind of deep dive is your thing, seriously, subscribe and ring the bell. We cover the strange, brilliant corners of aviation that most channels skip right over. And while you're at it, Tell me in the comments which aircraft you want me to break down next. Now here's where the story gets really interesting in 2026, because the Flying V is not the only one chasing this dream anymore. While a Dutch university was flying its 3-meter V over a German airbase, an American startup was quietly building something enormous in the California desert. And this one isn't a model. It's the real thing, full size. The company is called Jet Zero, founded in Long Beach, California, back in 2021. Their aircraft is a blended wing body, that manta ray shape where the fuselage and wings melt into one continuous lifting body. And their ambitions are staggering. Jet Zero claims their design, a 250-seat airliner they call the Z4, could cut fuel burn dramatically compared to conventional jets, with figures the company has put as high as 50% better fuel performance on a per-seat basis compared to an older aircraft like the Boeing 767. Now, 50% is the optimistic top end, and plenty of experts are skeptical of that exact number. Many studies land closer to 20 or 25%. But even the conservative figure would be revolutionary. And here's why Jet Zero matters so much. They're not just drawing pictures. In 2023, the U.S. Air Force awarded them a contract worth around $235 million to build and fly a full-scale demonstrator, because the same shape that saves an airline fuel could let a military tanker carry far more fuel on a mission. Jet Zero has said converting the Air Force's tanker, transport, and bomber fleets to this configuration could save something like $1 billion a year in fuel costs. That military money is the rocket fuel, pun intended. That's letting them move faster than almost anyone expected. And the progress is real. A subscale demonstrator called Pathfinder has been flying test sorties in California since 2024. The full-scale demonstrator is being assembled by Scaled Composites, which is a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman, the very same corporate lineage that traces back to Jack Northrop's flying wing legacy. Let that sink in for a second. We started this story with Jack Northrop, the man whose flying wing dream was crushed in the 1940s, who was reportedly wheeled in near the end of his life to see that his vision had finally flown as the B-2. And now the company carrying his name is helping build the radical wing aircraft of the 2020s in the same Mojave Desert where so much of America's experimental aviation has always been tested. History doesn't just rhyme here. It loops right back on itself. The dream the Hortons sketched in their gliders, the dream Jack Northrop died believing in, the dream that needed computers that didn't exist yet. It's being bolted together right now, full size, by their descendants. If you don't find that a little bit beautiful, I don't know what to tell you. There's even more proof the idea has momentum. Jet Zero isn't the only startup betting on radical shapes. Another company, Nautilus, has been developing its own blended wing aircraft aimed first at the cargo market. The logic being that freight doesn't care about windows or the passenger evacuation headaches, so a weird-shaped cargo hauler is an easier first step than a weird-shaped airliner. That's a smart, pragmatic way to crack the door open. Prove the shape hauling boxes, then graduate to hauling people. As of mid-2026, Jet Zero is moving at a blistering pace. The full-scale demonstrator, with a wingspan of around 178 feet and a gross weight in the range of 260,000 pounds, is targeted to fly around 2027. It'll fly on a pair of Pratt & Whitney engines, former Boeing 757 engines provided by Delta Airlines. And here's the kicker. In June 2026, Jet Zero broke ground on a brand new factory in Greensboro, North Carolina, that they say will be roughly twice the size of Boeing's giant Everett plant in Washington, the one that built the 747. They're building a factory the size of a small city before they've even flown the full-scale aircraft. That's either incredibly bold or incredibly reckless, depending on who you ask. Let me put some real numbers on just how expensive this gamble is, because it tells you everything about why radical aircraft are so rare. Jet Zero has reportedly raised or secured somewhere north of $1 billion in financing between its Air Force contract, government incentives, and commercial commitments. Sounds like a fortune, right? Well, here's a sobering quote from a well-known aerospace analyst. Jet Zero has raised $1 billion or so, and they have 11 or 12 billion to go. Entering this market, he said, is ridiculously expensive. 11 or 12 billion dollars, with a B. That's the price of admission just to bring a clean sheet airliner to market. That single fact explains why Boeing and Airbus mostly tweak existing designs instead of reinventing the airplane, and why it takes a strange alliance of military money, venture capital, and airline pre-orders to even attempt something this radical. There's also a genuinely clever engineering wrinkle worth mentioning. One of the milestones Jet Zero hit with its subscale Pathfinder vehicle was proving out a novel landing gear arrangement, sometimes described as a special takeoff and landing setup, because, just like the flying V, a blended wing has to manage that nose-high attitude on takeoff and landing. It's the same fundamental physics challenge the Concorde solved with its droop nose and the flying V is solving with its long landing gear. Three completely different aircraft, three different eras, all wrestling with the same stubborn law of aerodynamics. If your wing is doing something unusual, getting on and off the ground gracefully is hard. Engineering is full of these recurring puzzles that never really go away. They just get solved in new ways by each generation brave enough to try. And the airlines are paying attention. Delta Airlines signed on to provide expertise to the Z4's development, and United Airlines went further, announcing a purchase agreement for up to 200 of the commercial version if Jet Zero hits its milestones, including that 2027 first flight. When two of America's biggest airlines put their names on a radical new shape, you know something is shifting. As one Jet Zero executive put it bluntly, the tube and wing efficiency is maxed out. Nothing beats the physics of spreading lift across the whole span of the airplane. But here's the question you're probably actually wondering about. Forget the engineers and the executives. What would it be like to sit in one of these things as a regular passenger? And this is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the experience could be wildly different from the cramped tube you're used to. At an industry panel, representatives from Jet Zero, Delta, and United described a cabin that's triangular and flattened compared to today's narrow tubes, which creates far more open interior space. Some concepts imagine a theater-style cabin, wide, with multiple aisles, bigger overhead bins, dedicated storage, and more personal space in every class. Delta's people talked about the new shape giving the crew room to deliver a kind of next-level, white-glove service that's just impossible in a skinny tube. Jet Zero has even floated ideas like a central island or bar in the middle of the cabin. There's a trade-off, though, and it's the same one that haunts every flying wing-style design. In a wide body where the cabin spreads out sideways, a lot of seats end up nowhere near a window. The proposed solution is something straight out of science fiction but increasingly realistic. Virtual windows, screens that show the view outside, so even someone seated dead center gets a view of the clouds. Now, some people love that idea and some people hate it. There's something a little melancholy about replacing a real window with a screen. But honestly, if you've ever been stuck in a middle seat in the center section of a big wide body like a 747 or an A380, you already know what it's like to fly for hours without a window. So for a lot of passengers, this wouldn't actually be a downgrade at all. It might even come with more legroom and elbow room as a consolation prize. The Flying V takes a different approach to the same problem. Because its passengers sit within the two legs of the V rather than one giant flattened blob, the designers have talked about large windows along the leading edge of the wing and that whole menu of seating concepts I mentioned earlier. The lounge chairs, the group seating, the fold-down beds. Both designs are basically asking the same exciting question. If we're going to throw out the tube anyway, why not completely reimagine what the inside of an airplane feels like? For the first time in decades, the cabin isn't a fixed constraint. It's a blank canvas. And that's a genuinely thrilling prospect for anyone who's ever felt like a sardine at 35,000 feet. So now you've got two completely different bets on the same basic idea. The Flying V, a sleek, V-shaped, university-born concept with airline backing in Europe, and Jet Zero's Z4, a manta ray blended wing body, backed by the US military and major airlines, racing toward a full-scale flight. Same dream, different shapes, different paths. And they're not the only players either, because here's where the third giant enters the story. Airbus. Yes, the same Airbus that's quietly stayed connected to the Flying V has been running its own radical experiments. A few years back, Airbus unveiled a small demonstrator called MAVERIC, a remote-controlled blended wing body model used to test the handling of the shape. And Airbus folded blended wing thinking into its much bigger, much more famous moonshot. The Zero program, launched in 2020, aimed at putting a hydrogen-powered, zero-emission airliner into service. Now, this is where I have to be very honest with you about the messy reality of cutting-edge aviation, because it's not all triumphant test flights. The Zero program has had a rough couple of years. In early 2025, Airbus announced it was pushing back its original 2035 target for a hydrogen airliner by something like 5 to 10 years. And it slashed the program's budget and shelved a plan to test hydrogen propulsion on a modified A380. That's a real setback. hydrogen is brutally hard. Liquid hydrogen has to be stored at around -253 degrees Celsius, and it takes up roughly 4 times the volume of regular jet fuel, which is a nightmare to fit on an aircraft. But, and this is the fascinating part, that volume problem is exactly why the blended wing keeps coming up. A big, wide blended wing body has a massive internal belly, the perfect place to stash those huge, cold hydrogen tanks without stealing space from passengers. So even as Airbus delayed the timeline, it kept maturing the technology, and in 2025, it settled on hydrogen fuel cells, which turn hydrogen into electricity to spin propellers, producing nothing but water as exhaust, as its chosen path. The dream isn't dead at Airbus. It just got a dose of reality about how long this stuff actually takes. And that's the honest, grown-up version of this whole story. Radical aircraft are genuinely coming, but they come with delays, skepticism, enormous costs, and very real engineering walls. Anyone who tells you the tube is definitely dead by next decade is selling you something. And anyone who tells you nothing will ever change is ignoring a full-scale demonstrator being bolted together in the Mojave Desert right now. So here's the obvious question. If the flying wing idea is almost a century old, if the Hortons and Jack Northrop were building these things in the 1940s, why is it only now, in the 2020s, that it's finally becoming realistic for passenger planes? What changed? And the answer is a beautiful combination of 3 things that simply didn't exist back then. The first is computers and fly-by-wire flight control. Remember why Northrop's flying wings were canceled? They were unstable, constantly wanting to wander and yaw, and no human pilot could make corrections fast enough to keep them perfectly steady. Today, modern aircraft don't rely on the pilot's reflexes for that. A flight computer makes tiny adjustments to the control surfaces hundreds of times per second, far faster and more precisely than any human could. This is exactly the technology that let the B-2 finally fly the shape Northrop died believing in. A naturally twitchy aircraft can now be made rock steady by software. The instability that killed the flying wing in 1948 is, in 2026, just a solvable control problem. The second is materials. The old flying wings were built from aluminum, and the Hortons famously used steel and plywood. Today's radical aircraft lean heavily on carbon fiber reinforced composites, materials that are dramatically lighter and stronger, and which can be molded into the complex, curved, blended shapes these designs demand. The Flying V's projected weight savings depend partly on these composites. JetZero's demonstrator is being built by Scaled Composites, a company whose entire name is about exactly this. You simply could not build these shapes affordably and lightly without modern composite manufacturing. And the third is sheer computing power for design itself. Engineers can now simulate airflow over a wildly complex shape inside a computer, running what's called computational fluid dynamics, testing thousands of variations virtually before bending a single piece of metal. They build digital twins of the entire aircraft and even the entire factory. The Flying V team refined Justus Benad's original concept using exactly these tools and found the numbers got better. The Hortons were doing their aerodynamics with slide rules and intuition. Today's teams have supercomputers. That's the difference between guessing and knowing. Put those 3 together: fly-by-wire stability, composite materials, and simulation power. And suddenly the dream that was impossible in 1948 becomes merely difficult in 2026. Difficult, expensive, and uncertain, but possible. And in aviation, the leap from impossible to merely difficult is the leap that changes everything. Now let me connect all of this back to something, because I think it's the heart of the whole story. Remember Jack Northrop and his flying wing? Remember how the idea was right, the math was right, but the world wasn't ready? The technology wasn't there, the computers didn't exist, the will wasn't there? The flying wing dream sat dormant for 40 years until the moment was finally right, and then it came back as the B-2. The Flying V, the JetZero Z4, the Airbus blended wing. They might all be in a similar place right now, except the moment might finally have arrived. The ideas are sound. The efficiency gains are real and verified in research, wind tunnels, and now scale flights. But the full leap to a passenger airliner depends on 100 other things lining up. The technology maturing, the regulations adapting, the airlines committing, the money appearing. For the Flying V specifically, the team talks about a long road, moving from simulators to more wind tunnel work to a full cabin mock-up, and eventually a full-scale version for testing. It might happen in 15 years. It might happen in 30. It might get absorbed into some future design that doesn't even carry the name Flying V. or the lessons learned from it might quietly show up in the next generation of aircraft in ways we don't even notice. And here's something genuinely forward-looking about the Flying V design specifically. Because everything is integrated into that big V structure, there's flexibility in what powers it. In its current design, the Flying V flies on regular kerosene using the most fuel-efficient turbofan engines available today. But the designers have pointed out that the shape could be adapted relatively easily to future propulsion, electrically boosted turbofans, or even hydrogen. Justice Benad himself has noted that hydrogen tanks could be integrated into the shape of the aircraft fairly naturally, the same logic that's driving Airbus toward blended wings for its hydrogen plane. So the Flying V isn't just a one-trick efficiency machine. It's potentially a platform that could ride whatever wave of cleaner propulsion comes next. That's a big deal, because it means the design doesn't become obsolete the moment the industry shifts away from kerosene. Now, let's zoom out, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. There's a reason these projects are getting serious attention right now and not, say, 20 years ago. And that reason is one of the biggest pressures facing aviation today: fuel and emissions. Air travel is incredible. It connects the entire planet. It's gotten dramatically safer over the decades, and it's woven into the global economy. But it also burns enormous amounts of jet fuel and produces a significant share of human carbon emissions. As the world pushes harder and harder to cut those emissions, aviation is under real pressure to become cleaner and more efficient. And there are only so many ways to do that. You can make engines more efficient. You can use lighter materials. You can explore alternative fuels like sustainable aviation fuel and eventually things like hydrogen. Or, and this is the big one, you can change the shape of the aircraft itself to fundamentally reduce how much energy it takes to fly. That last option is the most radical and, potentially, the most powerful. But it's worth being fair and noting it's not the only game in town. There's a quieter, less flashy path the whole industry is also pursuing right now: sustainable aviation fuel, often shortened to SAF. This is fuel made from things like used cooking oil, agricultural waste, and other renewable sources, and its huge advantage is that it can be blended into existing aircraft today, no radical redesign required. The catch is that it's still expensive and not produced anywhere near the volume the industry needs. So you've got two philosophies competing for attention and money. One says, keep the planes basically the same, change what you pour into them. The other says, change the plane itself. The truth is, the future probably needs both. Cleaner fuel poured into more efficient shapes. They're not really rivals so much as two halves of the same puzzle. And that's exactly the door the Flying V and its airframe rivals are trying to push open. KLM tied the Flying V to its Fly Responsibly Sustainability initiative, and the airline has consistently ranked among the most sustainability-focused carriers in industry indices. And there's something poetic about KLM specifically backing this. KLM is the oldest airline in the world still operating under its original name, founded over a century ago. An airline that has been flying since the era of wood and fabric biplanes is now betting on an aircraft shaped like nothing that has ever carried a paying passenger. That's the entire span of aviation history, from the first fragile airliners to a V-shaped flying wing wrapped up in one company's logo. For an airline, this isn't just feel-good marketing. A 20% reduction in fuel burn isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. Multiply it across thousands of flights, millions of passengers, billions of liters of fuel, and you start talking about an enormous impact, both on the planet and on the bottom line of every airline on Earth. Fuel is one of the single biggest costs an airline faces, and one of the very few they can't control, as anyone who watched oil prices swing during recent global tensions knows all too well. Cut that by a fifth, and you've changed the entire economics of flying. There's a phrase that the Flying V's project leader used that stuck with me. He pointed out that existing aircraft configurations only allow incremental, minor improvements. And remember, a Jet Zero executive said almost the exact same thing. The tube and wing is maxed out. Two different teams, two different continents, two different shapes, reaching the identical conclusion. The shape we've been flying for 70 years is basically wrung dry. You can keep polishing it, shaving off a percent here and there, but the big leaps are gone. To get a genuine step change in efficiency, you have to be brave enough to change the shape. And that's why a project that started as a student's thesis and grew up in a university lab in the Netherlands genuinely matters. Not because it's going to replace the 737 next Tuesday. It's not. But because it's a real, flight-tested attempt to answer one of the most important questions in modern aviation. How do we keep the world connected while burning a lot less to do it? Let me zoom in on one more thing that I think makes the Flying V genuinely special compared to its rivals, and it comes back to that 95% parts figure I mentioned earlier. Most radical designs force airlines into an all-or-nothing bet. But the Flying V structure was deliberately designed to be stretched or shortened, like building blocks, so a manufacturer could offer a whole family. A smaller version, a bigger version, all sharing the vast majority of their components. For an airline, that's enormous. It means cheaper maintenance, shared spare parts, pilots who can fly multiple variants, and a production line that doesn't have to be reinvented for every size. It directly attacks the single biggest weakness of the blended wing body, which has to be custom designed for each size. That kind of practical, industrial thinking is exactly what separates a concept that stays in a museum from one that might actually reach a runway. The Flying V wasn't just designed to be efficient in the air. It was designed to be buildable, sellable, and operable in the real world. And that might end up mattering more than any aerodynamic number. And here's a thought I want to leave you with. The reason the tube and wings airplane has survived for 70 years isn't because it's perfect. It's because it's good enough, and good enough is incredibly hard to dethrone. Every airliner you've ever flown on is, in a sense, a prisoner of a decision made in the 1950s. The decision that the tube is just how planes are shaped. The Flying V, the Jet Zero Z4, the Airbus blended wing. They are some of the boldest attempts in decades to escape that prison and ask, out loud, what an airplane could look like if we designed it fresh. Today, with everything we now know about aerodynamics, materials, and computers. Maybe the Flying V works. Maybe Jet Zero gets there first. Maybe Airbus cracks hydrogen. Maybe the future of flight is V-shaped, or manta ray-shaped, or something we haven't even sketched yet. But every revolution in aviation started exactly like this, with a strange-looking idea that most people dismissed, built by a few stubborn people who refused to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. The Flying Wing took 40 years and a dead inventor's vindication to finally fly as the B-2. The Flying V started with one student, one thesis, one patent, and a researcher curious enough to check the math. And right now, in a desert in California and a lab in the Netherlands, the next chapter is being built. Who knows which one becomes the airplane your grandkids take for granted? So let me throw it back to you one last time. Do you think the airplane of the future will still be a tube with wings? Or will it be something radical? A V? A manta ray? Something that looks as strange to us now as a jet engine did to people a century ago? Drop your prediction in the comments. I genuinely want to read them. And if you made it all the way here, you're exactly the kind of curious person this channel is built for. So hit subscribe, ring the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.